I won't be shocked if you do get some pushback about the fact that Epictetus is a girl. But I would like to think that that pushback is ameliorated by the content of the story and what they see.
Well, let's do this. So, this one, it's interesting. Our first collaboration was so fun and so easy and straightforward. I found this book to be harder in a variety of ways. I want to talk about all of them. But the fact that it's not out in the world, or it's not out in the world in March when I wanted, struck me as a sort of Stoic reality, which is you have all your plans, you have how you want to do things, and then sort of life gets in the way. In this case, a global printing shortage, which has repeatedly delayed the book.
That's fascinating. Printing in terms of just paper itself, or inks, or
all of it. So what happened was that there's been a printer shortage in the U.S. for some time, dating well back before the pandemic. Different plants closed, different printers closed. Book sales have continued to go up. I think people were kind of predicting that that physical book sales would decline steadily as they were, and the opposites happened. So there was too much demand, which is a great problem to have. But
yes.
Then with the pandemic, and then also the unrest in Europe and Brexit and a bunch of other stuff, all the big publishers have been onshoring their printing. So they've moved back to the US and thus overwhelmed the demand. And that's delayed things. So it's not that so basically The Girl Who Would Be Free went into the publisher in February, which is the same time that The Boy Who Would Be King went in a year earlier. And instead of coming out in early March, it came out in June. It's coming out in July. So that's how backed up they are.
Wow. Coming out, do you have any idea when in July?
Yes. Yeah. When people will be listening to this, it will be out, barring some unforeseen further delay. But July 8th is when we're putting it out.
Okay. Super. That sounds great.
But I feel like as an artist or a creator, this must be part of it for you too, in that you do your part, like you illustrate it, but then you have so little control over what the collaborators do with it. You have relatively little control over what the market does with it. I think an underrated skill for a creator is the ability to just sort of go, it'll come out when it comes out. It'll be what it'll be. And I just have to you almost have to get to a Zen-like place with it. Cause if you hold on to it too tight, the thing, it'll just break your heart over and over again.
Well, it will. But the nice thing about what I do is that after I'm done my work, I know this is essentially your baby. You have your money behind this. So I'm out of once I was finished with everything I had to do, I could step back, and what happened, however it unfolded, would unfold in its own way, So I just wait for the end results.
But I imagine you've had to get that way over your career. Like if Rolling Stone commissions a drawing from you, you do that drawing. But when the story runs, whether the story is good or not, so many of those other factors are out of your control. I imagine you've had to get a little self-contained with the parts of the process that you care about, namely the parts of it you control, which is the work that you do.
Right, and do it to the best of my ability. Be very professional and actually be more than professional. Really put your heart and soul into it.
Yeah, Epictetus actually talks about this in his discourses. He talks about how we're sort of all actors in a play, and we're not the director. He doesn't exactly say who the director is, but accepting that you're not the director is, I think, a critical part. He's like, you still have to act the hell out of your role, but you have to understand that you're not the playwright, right? And once you accept that, it's weirdly freeing, because now you can just focus on doing a really good job on your part.
Exactly. I would never make a good general or colonel or anything like that. I'd be at maximum, I'd probably be a very competent sergeant, just manning my outpost and doing the best I could out there.
I mean, I have found that, right? Like, so these two books, The Boy Who Would Be King and The Girl Who Would Be Free, I self-published, which meant I had all the control that I sometimes am frustrated that I don't have on my bigger books. And, you sort of be careful what you wish for, because you get the control, but now you also have all the responsibility and the frustration and the obligation. You realize it has given me some empathy for my publisher, because suddenly I'm like, oh yeah, a lot of this isn't in their control either. And I'm taking personally or holding them responsible for things that were out of their hands too.
Right. But also, being that you've self-published both of these books, did you find that I don't see any name publications who have reviewed The Boy,
Yeah.
We got great comments on the Amazon website. I mean, wonderful comments. So, but no New York Times, no nothing like that.
Epictetus said that philosophy wasn't this dry, abstract thing. It was a thing, he said, you should be talking about, writing down, reading about, exploring with other people all the time. He said, constantly have it at hand. That's how I think about philosophy. And it's weird. For the last 5 years, every single day, I've been writing this free email about Stoic philosophy. It's been not just cool to meet all these fellow practitioners of Stoic philosophy, but in writing about it, talking about it, reading it for our podcast, I have got to internalize these ideas in a way that I never would have been able to under any other circumstances. That's the idea. Philosophy is something we're supposed to engage in, not keep in these dusty old books or read once and be done with. It's a constant process. And I think that's why the email has worked so well for the people reading about it and sharing it and talking about it, all of that as well. So I'd love to have you join us on this email. You can sign up at dailystoic.com/daily email. It's totally free, no spam. You can unsubscribe whenever you want. I've basically given away a book for free every single year for 5 years, and I'm going to keep on doing it until I drop dead. Check it out, dailystoic.com/daily email. Yeah, and that is something that I think it matters to some people. And having, I've hit number 1 on the New York Times list. I've spent hundreds of weeks on the other list with my books. It was freeing for me in another way to have success on my previous books, because I realized that matters so much less than you think it does. What actually matters is, do human beings like the book? And have you gotten it into as many of their hands as possible? So I could have gone the traditional route with both of these books. It would have meant worse economics, but I was less concerned with that. It would have meant less control over the timeline, and it would have meant less control over the content. So when I went to my publisher with The Boy Who Would Be King, they were like, we love the idea. We see how it fits with all your other books, but they're like, we would like it to be about 10,000 words. They wanted it to be more of a novella or a longer story. And they were like, that's what we're interested in buying. And I was like, I understand what you're interested in buying, but here's what I'm interested in making. And I was interested in writing a fable that was illustrated in the way that you illustrated it. I feel very lucky that you and I got connected by Sean Coyne, because our visions of it were remarkably aligned. But my vision and the publisher's vision were very much not aligned. Mm-hmm. And so I had to decide what's more important to me, having access to, say, being on the New York Times list, being reviewed, getting some critical feedback, or publishing the book that I want to publish. You got to decide what race you're trying to win, Yeah.
Well, you made the right choice, obviously. And the fact that we got so many, that the book got so many great comments, and all these, what I especially love is when people talk about how their kids continually come back to the book.
Yes.
In those comments. And that was probably the most consistent comment I got from The Boy, from friends who I gave the book to. And they, even Matt Taibbi was telling me, like, his son read it all the way on a long drive. I mean, over and over again. He just was hooked by the story.
That's what I love to hear too. And I think that the hard part is, how do you measure the success of what you're doing? And in a lot of ways, sales or revenue, or did important people like critics accept it or award it something? Those are the easiest ways to measure success. Did it accomplish what you wanted to accomplish as an artist? Is it true to the vision? Did it make somebody's life better? Those metrics are much harder to measure by. But I do feel like as I've gone on in my career, I have gotten better at prioritizing those things and sitting with the ambiguity of it. Like I know it's a success because it did what I wanted to do. Whether that's a shared assumption with other people, I have to sit with the divergence there.
Right. Well, Stephen Pressfield writes about that. One of his topics is, what happens if your book doesn't sell?
Yeah.
Well, does that negate the creative process? Does that create all your effort? No, it doesn't.
But that is the fundamental tenet of Stoicism also, right? What part of the process is in your control? The effort, the work, the intention, the vision, all of that is in your control. The external reception, the world events in which your book is really, all of that stuff is outside of your control. And so you have to decide what you measure. And I think ideally as an artist or an entrepreneur, whatever it is, you got to get to a place where you are the one who decides whether you succeeded or not.
Right. Let's get into the nuts and bolts here, because this was a definitely a different experience for me than The Boy Who Would Be King.
Yeah, I heard you say a bunch of times it was much harder for you. I'm curious why that was.
Well, first of all, once I got the manuscript and I read it, I said, "Okay, great. This will be terrific." And then when I reread it, and then I kind of like compared it to The Boy. I said, this is way heavier. Already the theme behind this book is much more nuanced, much more layered than The Boy Who Would Be King. The Boy Who Would Be King is essentially your classic hero's journey.
Yes.
He doesn't, he runs away from his challenge, finally accepts the challenge, overcomes it, brings back something to his community. Mm-hmm. This one starts off right away heavy.
Yeah.
She's a slave. The first couple of pages we're talking about how you're talking about, and I'm drawing the lives of slaves in Rome. And so we have that. And then we have just the philosophy itself. As opposed to the Boy Who Would Be King, yes, Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic, and we're getting snippets of what Rusticus is telling him, and we're getting that in a subtle way what's going on. But here in the Girl Who Would Be Free, you're getting Stoicism, and you're getting Stoicism not on how to be a king, but how to manage, how to navigate a life of incredible suffering.
Yeah.
That's heavy, and I remember, I remember so many times as I was working on the illustrations and rereading your copy and just seeing how do we manage these images. I said, "What's this is good. This is different from how to explain The Boy to a child. This is going to be like, why are they suffering so much? Why is Epictetus on crutches? Why are the slaves like this?
Sure.
And then what's the parent going to do in terms of it's a great opportunity for a parent to get hopefully into a little bit of history and explain that for much of human history, slavery was the norm.
I'm a big believer in not babying your kids when it comes to books and pretending the world is something different than it is. But I also dislike there's a number of kids' books that are just dealing with themes that sort of kids have no business dealing with. Like I don't think making a kid's book about a school shooting seems, to me to be reversed, right? I don't think there's a positive lesson in there. But I did want to deal. I guess I liked the challenge of like Epictetus has this horrendous life in real life, and
Right.
somehow it never breaks him, it never changes him, and somehow he goes on to do all this amazing stuff and is seen as a beacon of inspiration and hope. So, like, how do you get from A to Z there? That to me is the fascinating challenge of that story, because by any measure, Epictetus's story should be a depressing example of the worst of what human beings are capable of, and instead somehow is an example of the best of what human beings are capable of in real life, not even in this story.
Exactly. And the emotional maturity, the philosophical maturity, that I have to admit, I don't even know if I would be able to manage that kind of that level of peace with my situation.
Yes, I don't think so either. I guess I imagine one of the challenges of the book, and I think you mentioned this to me, is that because the book is more philosophical. I imagine the challenge that philosophical or action based as a writer. It's not that difficult. I mean, obviously, you always like a story more than an idea, but this one, I really tried to address the ideas of Stoicism more, although obviously Epictetus lives them. But I was thinking of the example where I was talking about how the words we use for things is almost a form of magic. It changes how we see them. The words we use for things changes what they mean. As a writer, that's a pretty straightforward sentence to write in a kid's book. But I remember you were like, how the hell am I supposed to illustrate this? How do you make a picture of that idea that's not a symbol or something, and you ended up coming up with something cool with like hands and a bird appearing from Epictetus's father's hands. But I imagine illustrating abstract ideas is much harder than the narration of it, actual events.
Yes, because you're reading it, you can in a weird way, you visualize what the author is writing. But to take that and actually make a visual that maybe not everybody will even jump on as being a correct visual, that's always a challenge for any illustrator. There are many times I see an illustration in a magazine or a newspaper or illustrating a topic or a story, and I'm going, I don't know if I definitely don't think I'd do it that way. I don't know how I would do it, but I don't think this is not reading to me. It's nice to look at, but I'm not sure if it's addressing the topic.
So how do you think about that? Like, let's say there was a passage in the book, or a magazine comes to you with an opinion piece that needs a graphic or an illustration, and it's not immediately obvious what it is. So like, the first page of this book, it's talking about life as a slave. You're like, okay, I just have to figure out what the life of a slave looked like and document that. When it's a more abstract idea and it's not immediately intuitively obvious what it is, what's your process of figuring it out? Do you just start sketching? Do you go for a walk and think? How do you crack those non-obvious puzzles?
Well, in editorial illustration, especially if you're doing political type of editorial illustration, there are certain, cliche is not the right word, but there are certain formats that you can revert to.
Conceits.
Conceits. I mean, you go back to Thomas Nast, go all the way back to Granville or Gilray and stuff like that, or people like that. And there's a whole history of how to portray things. So if something doesn't strike you right away, to create a concrete visual, there's always this history that's right behind you.
Right.
I can always go to all the books and start fishing through. Or if I'm feeling frisky, I'll just go to Bugs Bunny. I'll just go to Warner Brothers, Looney Tunes. I mean, a slapstick idea, especially in terms of political illustration, for me has always worked.
Interesting. So you sort of go back to sources of inspiration in the way that if you were trying to write a song, you might go play similar songs to the one that you want to write or the mood you're trying to evoke. And in the process of kind of riffing and messing around, it just appears what you want to go, the inspiration appears.
Right. That's a pretty good analogy there.
I was just actually reading Stephen Pressfield's new book. It's called Put Your Ass Where Your Heart Wants to Be. How much of it for you is like walking around and getting inspiration, or it's like, no, I got to put my butt in the chair and do the work, and eventually the muses will visit me?
Depends on the time. Can I be honest?
Yeah.
A lot of time it's spent over there, but a lot of time it's spent outdoors in the garden. You could spend, if I have enough time, and that's not always the case on editorial jobs, because now the goddamn news cycle is so fast, you have to get things produced very quickly.
Sure.
But if there's that time and ideas are not coming, and you're just at a loss, then I'll go outside and I'll mow while I'm working in the garden or while I'm cleaning out the chicken coops or whatever the hell. And I've got that time to think.
Yeah.
And I think the best thing in the world a lot of times is to get away from the drawing table. For me, I know I've learned enough about how Stephen works. I don't know if I have that discipline to just sit down there against a bare wall with the desk facing the wall and just do something. I kind of am a procrastinator and a tangential goofer.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff that goes on. There's a way that you can create all sorts of distractions, which is what we call the
resistance.
The resistance. Yes.
Do you believe in the magic of it though? Like, are you ever just amazed that you're just sitting there and you're like, where did that come from?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you know what's even better is if you're in a conference with an art director, either in person or on a Zoom or just going back and forth. But usually there's got to be some sort of visceral activity, a Zoom or actually dealing with the art director in person. But when you're bouncing back and forth and suddenly you got it, there it is. And you're like, where did that come from? But it's a great quantum jump. I call them quantum jumps. Something triggers something that it's not A to B, it's actually going to A to W.
Yeah.
And W takes you to Z, but it's a large jump.
It suddenly gives you enough of the bulk of it that you now can, like that thing about like feeling an elephant, you're feeling, suddenly you're like, oh, no. I have enough sense of this now that I understand what I'm dealing with.
Yes. Which is one of the reasons it was always good to go back to you and just throw something out. There's something about a collab. Part of what I do too, and one of the reasons I think that I've lasted this long in the business is that I'm not necessarily an ego-driven illustrator. I'm very much into the collaborative thing because I'm illustrating your story or I'm illustrating somebody else's article. I'm not really illustrating my own story. If I do, then it goes on. It's a sketch or it's a drawing or it's an idea, and I'll put it on Instagram or Facebook. But generally speaking, I'm doing somebody else's work.
How do you think about that? Because I imagine, like, I think every creative person struggles with notes, right? Like, I don't know if you saw the last season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, Larry David sitting down at this meeting and he's like, I think we're going to work great together. Everyone's excited. And he's like, all right, he's like, one last thing, don't give me any fucking notes. And they all go, ha, 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 ha. He laughs and he's laughing with them. And then he's like, I'm not joking. And then he walks out of the room, which is, I think, kind of the artist's fantasy. And you think about getting to a point where it's just you and no one can tell you what to do. And notes are often quite terrible, but also collaboration is key, and ego is the enemy, I would say. How do you think about the art of notes, especially when I got to imagine a good chunk of your notes are coming from people who have no idea how to do what you do or how what you do works. So I imagine a lot of the notes are like impossible on top of it.
I'm lucky. I've generally worked with really great art directors, especially in the last 10 years. Much of my early career was just grinding out a lot of work that paid the bills. But I'm at a point in my life now, at least since the mid 2000s, where the people I'm working with, almost to a person, are just a pleasure to work with. So that, going back to what we were talking about before, you're having a conversation, and a word pops up, and that's the word that I was missing all the time while I was sitting at the drawing table, and that word triggers an idea, okay, or actually fills in a space where the idea works, because there's a lot of times you're kicking around, sure. And we were doing this with both books, but I think even more with the girl, where there was always this sketch that I'd send. Oftentimes it was a sketch that I'd send, but in the back of my head I'm going, yeah, but this is not resolving a certain part of the visual narrative. It's not solving what's happening later on, or it's not reflecting what happened earlier. And I'd have to keep on going back and forth with you or Nils and see where's that missing piece in the puzzle.
Yeah, no, and Nils, for people who don't know, is my editor and sometimes writing partner on a lot of projects, who I've worked with on all of my books, and he and I have a unique collaborative relationship in that he is really good at helping me finish thoughts, or, there's that Mark Twain line about how the right word and the wrong word is the difference between lightning and lightning bug. Right. And you know what I mean? Just the right, the concept, just 1 degree different can be the difference between it working and not working. And I think that's the problem. If you're the kind of person that's like, no notes, I'm the expert, I know what I'm doing. In a lot of cases, that protects your work, because you don't have incompetent people bossing you around, messing with your vision. But it also prevents you from that thing that doesn't quite working perfectly. And I think the difference between Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm, although they're both fantastic shows, and obviously Curb went a lot longer, is I'm often watching Curb Your Enthusiasm and I go, this is just not, it's not that it's lazy, it's just not quite as polished and tightened as it would be if there was a Seinfeld in there who was obsessed about details and was so meticulous.
I'll go with you on that. That's a writer. That's somebody who's writing, assessing something. It's like when I'm lucky enough to be with a musician and we go to a concert and they're breaking it down for me. I'm going, I've never even thought about that, know. But they're hearing something that a pro hears,
Yeah. Or
even when I go with a friend who's a really great painter, and we go to a museum. I'm okay. I paint all right, but I'm not technical. And then suddenly they're breaking it down, and you're going, it's so obvious. How could I miss that? So yeah, I know what you're talking about, and that's fine. And actually, a little raggedness never hurts, which is one of the reasons I try not to make a polished finish, like not touched by human hands kind of image. So you'll see some ghost lines. You might see the history of the drawing happening.
I like that. I think it creates kind of a sense of movement and authenticity and realness to the illustrations. And so when I saw your first drawings of Marcus for The Boy Who Would Be King, I was just like, yes, this is exactly, because I didn't want it to feel like a polished children's book. I wanted it to feel, I don't know. I imagine part of what's exciting but also frustrating about what you do is like I had a vague sense of what I wanted, but it was also ineffable and impossible to express. And your job was to go bring that into existence, even though I'm not actually able to tell you what I want, but I'm going to immediately and vehemently know if it's not what I want, which is kind of a philosophical thing. Like, I don't know what I want, but I can tell you I hate all these things that you just did, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that must be
Yeah.
so strange.
Yeah. But you never really in the time that we've worked together, you've never really shot anything down. I think we've gone through various stages of ideas, let's say per page.
Yes.
I don't think there was one page that we created that was really spot on right from the beginning. Maybe a few, but everything needed to be tweaked because everything needed to correlate before and what's coming. Especially, these are books that have an illustration on almost every page, if not every page, and therefore all the more onus is on me to make sure I got the images right. Your copy is already down for the most part. You did a little bit of readjusting
on this one than the last one for sure. I was editing up towards the end on this one. I don't know why that was, but there were things that I thought were almost there, but at every review of the drawings would create a slightly clearer sense of what it should be. And I feel like that final 10% was actually really important.
Yeah, I agree. Because I remember when we were going through the final draft, a look through the book with the images, and I remember looking at the page. I said, "Man, he didn't write that the last time."
Yeah.
But it's making more sense now with the image that's on the page.
Yes.
What's the most current iteration of the copy? So that's good. So yes, and even going back to comparing the two books, we know pretty well, based on sculptings, of what Marcus Aurelius looked like.
Yes.
All right? And I don't think we really know what Rusticus looked like. We can assess, we can kind of guess. But Marcus Aurelius, we do know what he looks like. We have a teenage image of him. And I think even a young boy. There's nothing on Epictetus.
Which probably tells us something about how slaves were seen, right? Like, Marcus Aurelius is famous from a young age. So there's descriptions of him. There's statues of him, as you said, even as a boy. I mean, Epictetus's name literally means acquired one. And he was a slave for the first 30 years of his life. So we can't, even if he went on to be famous and well known and would teach the emperors and become Marcus Aurelius's favorite philosopher, it doesn't erase the fact that for 30 years of his life, at least, he was considered less than human and not, if not worthy of a name, certainly wasn't worthy of being carved into marble or described, you know?
Right. Mary Beard talks about that when she talks about, does her lectures on Roman histories. And she's like, you go down the Appian Way or wherever they had all the families had all the statues of family members who died. She goes, it's not a story of slaves. It's essentially a story of the 1%, the people who could afford to put up a monument to a family member. Sometimes you get a slave, but that would be a slave that was really integrated into the family and maybe became a wife, you know?
Yeah, and it's well. So I wanted to talk about this because I just got this email today. The customer service people at Daily Stoic forwarded it over to me. I'm going to read this to you. It says, I'm a very big fan of Ryan Holiday, but I am very disappointed upon hearing about the girl who would be free. In today's political climate, it is bad enough with all the white male bashing, and it is nice to have a bastion to get away from it all, mainly Stoicism. And now you take an epic tale of bravery and temperance and Epictetus, and this is spelled wrong, Epictetus was definitely a white male. I see no need to feminize him, to pretend he was female. Females have their own stories to tell in history. This was quite a disservice to Epictetus and shameful, and I can only regard this as playing off the political climate to make a profit, and it makes me see through a different set of lenses. This will never reach Ryan, of course it did, but maybe someone else will read it and shake their head in unison, like I am now picturing someone writing about Epictetus as a female. This makes absolutely no sense and can only be a play on feminizing men, telling little boys that not only do they not have to be men, they can be girls also. I'm not against anyone and don't have any phobias, but you could have written a story for females, or for the females, without trying to turn Epictetus, one of the greatest philosophers ever, into a female. I quit. I'm flabbergasted, shaking my head.
I'll let you go first on the comments because she is essentially addressing your philosophical decision to switch the sexes.
Well, I'd be curious to hear what you think. To me, it was a pretty straightforward decision. I had written the boy who would be king, and I have two boys, so naturally, there wasn't any part of me that was like, Marcus Aurelius is a boy. Of course, I'm going to write a story to my boy about the story of Marcus Aurelius. But I heard a lot of notes from people who really liked the book, and they just said, I also have a little girl. Is there any version of the book you're planning on doing that would make them feel included? And I did actually try to address this in The Boy Who Would Be King. The last page, or the last pages, say something like, now many boys and girls have ruled since Marcus Aurelius, right? I was trying to say this was a specific story about a boy, not this is a story about how boys should become kings. But as I was thinking about doing a book, a second book, I was like, I wanted to write about a female Stoic because I thought it would be interesting. I thought it would be different. I thought it's important that it reach all genders. And so I was originally going to do a story about Portia Cato. This would be Cato's daughter. But from what even from what we know of her historically, she is, although really interesting and really inspiring, and I write about her in Lives of the Stoics, it's just the arc of her story is not that great. She's like a wife, a widow, and then she commits suicide. She's a very strong and brave woman, but there's not that much of an arc there. And so I was like, you know what? I just want to tell a great story. And what do I care? Like, what does it matter? The least important thing about Epictetus in real life is that he happened to be a man. Do you know what I mean? So to me, it was an easy decision, artistically, creatively, but also ethically. And I'd be curious what your reaction was to that when I first told you about him, and then how you came to think about it as you were doing the book.
Ironically, the one thing that I objected to with regard to making Epictetus a girl was Epictetus is such an ugly name, such an ugly word. It doesn't roll off the tongue. You know,
Sure.
It's not Daphne. It's not Diana. It's Epictetus. And every time we say, every time it came Epictetus, and I'm trying to visualize an Epictetus as a girl,
Sure.
which by the way became the real challenge. So, and once you explained, you basically said the same thing when you first proposed this idea to me. And other than the fact that in my mind, I'm thinking as an illustrator, okay, so how do we make him a girl, a young girl? We were starting off around 11 years old or so.
Yes.
What do we have in terms of reference? I mean, the deep dives into research were once again just really fascinating to just go into it. I would hope that the person who wrote that, was it a woman? Did you say?
No, it was a man, of course.
It was a man.
It's obviously a very angry white man who wrote that email.
Yeah, but I would hope that individual would look at the book, would read the book, and also identify, as opposed to the Marcus Aurelius book, part of the the research and the development of Epictetus, her character, we went through a long time where I was just feeding you ideas how I was visualizing her, and she was tough because we know he was Greek by origin, so we're not drawing a Scandinavian, okay?
Yes.
We're not drawing a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. We are drawing somebody from that part of the world first.
Well, that's a really important point too, because this idea that the Stoics were white men is a lie we have told ourselves, not just historically, but in the history of art, right? Epictetus comes from what is modern day Turkey, right? Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, comes from Cyprus, but he's described repeatedly as swarthy. The idea that these were blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans is just a convenient fiction that we want to believe, when in fact the ancient world, was more diverse than we'd like to think it was. Not that than we allow it to be, which is a shame, because it doesn't matter what someone looked like or where they're from. What matters is that we relate, like that you can adopt anyone as, one of your kind.
Yeah, it became irrelevant to me whether Epictetus was a girl or a boy. For me, the challenge was how do I create her? Then how do I infuse her? Because she is in so much of the book.
Yes.
And so much of the book, as opposed to the boy, so much of this book is going to rely on the viewer connecting with the various expressions that Epictetus is making. She is much less. She's actually reacting to a lot of things in the story that's happening to her, and as opposed to being a mover, she's kind of like reacting. She's observing. She's responding. And if you really want to make her dilemmas with the philosophy make sense, you've really got to hope to you successfully engage the viewer, the reader, with the character, with the expressions that I'm putting in there. So we went through an awful long time before we even started rolling with the book. What does she look like? Who is she?
Well, it's interesting too, because we tend to bring our prejudices are so innate and natural that we tend to assume that everyone is similarly prejudiced. And I don't mean that just in the racist sense. Although I remember when I moved to the South, it would be amazing how often other people who were white would feel like in private they could be more openly prejudiced because they would assume, obviously, you're like them and would not be offended by that. Do you know what I mean?
It's a tribal thing. It's like
totally.
It's like when Trent Lott was doing some sort of when Strom Thurmond was leading the Senate, and Trent Lott broke out of the Southern gentility and actually said what was really on his mind was that if we had followed Strom's philosophy or way of doing things, it would have been a lot better,
Well, and so it's funny, right? We assume, oh, I like Epictetus, so obviously Epictetus is white like me, that obviously Stoicism is for men. But what I find so fascinating about Epictetus's real story is his teacher, Musonius Rufus, who I also write about in Lives of the Stoics. What's fascinating about Musonius Rufus is, first off, he's a remarkably progressive guy in that he's teaching slaves philosophy, right? Like that he would even take Epictetus on as a student. This guy who'd had this horrible life and would teach him and make him what he was is, I think, already a testament to something. But Musonius Rufus was controversial in his own time in that he advocated for the teaching of men and women in his classes. He thought that women should be taught philosophy because it's basically his point is there's nothing gendered about virtue. Courage is genderless. It might take different forms, especially in the ancient world, might take different forms, but courage is courage. Temperance is temperance. Justice is justice, and wisdom is wisdom. And, so it's actually quite possible that there was a female Epictetus in those classes, right? Like, and it's only that we're so, a fish doesn't know it's wet. We're so used to thinking of philosophers as men, as white men, because that's what artistically we've represented them to us. That anyone who's surprised by Epictetus being a girl in this book, I think you're actually revealing something that should give you a moment of pause.
Yeah. But again, it's not unusual. I'm not shocked. I won't be shocked if you do get some pushback about the fact that Epictetus is a girl. But I would like to think that pushback modifies, is ameliorated by what they read, the content of the story, and what they see.
Yes. Well, and look, I would, for every person who's slightly offended or turned off by the decision to make Epictetus a girl, I am heartened or more excited about the potential young girl or mother or father who might have thought that Stoicism might not be appealing to their kid, and the book actually makes the ideas accessible and relatable. Representation is so important. And obviously, as just a white dude, I've grown up my whole life seeing people like me on television, right? Although I was reading I read Judd Apatow's new book, and he was talking about how one of the things that motivated him as a creator was like, there were never any regular dudes in movies. They were always like chiseled, supermodels, right? And he tried, if you think about Judd Apatow's movies, they're all about regular people, right? And so part of what he was trying to do was represent people like him on the screen. So we know from all different minorities, and we mean that in the most general sense, anyone who is not like everyone else, that representation is such a huge part of your experience in culture. And so it was really important to me for something that is fictional, right? Ultimately, everything in the book is made up. There are quotes in Epictetus's mouth that are loosely tied to Epictetus's thinking, but I also bring in the Serenity Prayer, and I assign quotes from, for instance, Agrippinus to Musonius Rufus. Like I'm playing with the boundaries of reality, because that's what you get to do in a work of fiction. Mm-hmm. But all the choices I was making were around the idea at an early age of introducing the ideas of Stoicism to people when it can make the biggest difference.
Right. Going back to that letter.
Yeah.
There's no. I'm assuming how did the person read the book?
They haven't. That's the funny thing. This is purely a reaction to the title of the book.
Okay, so if you read the book, you're not advocating one thing or the other. You're not saying that boys can be girls and girls can be boys. You're telling the story of a character
who has the name of a real person. Who has the name of a real person
who in this story is a girl.
Yes.
This reminds me back when black actors were starting to make the stage, Broadway stage, and there were critics. There was one in particular who thought it was absolutely horrible to cast black actors in Shakespeare.
Yes.
Other than Othello maybe, but it was ridiculous. It was out of control. I'm not naming the critic. I know who it is. And
well, no, famously Orson Welles did a version of Macbeth in the 30s of entirely black actors, and it was immensely controversial, but also very much ahead of its time.
Yeah. Well, Welles was a brilliant individual, regardless of his craziness, his own personal craziness.
We're all crazy.
We're all crazy.
No, I think about this too. It's like, I can't think of something less stoic than being very offended about a book you haven't read because it features a girl instead of a boy, right? One of my favorite lines, this is actually in the back of the book. Epictetus in real life said, look, when you find yourself offended or upset about things, remind yourself that you are complicit in having taken offense, right? Essentially that it takes two to tango, that we control our reactions. And so, let's say it was an immense perversion of what the philosophy was. And that in this book, I've committed a sacrilege, right? Don't care. Someone always has the ability, as Marcus Aurelius says, to have no opinion, to not care, to not read it, to tune it out. And so it's interesting how that even the historical understanding and discussion of Stoicism challenges us as Stoics to practice what we preach, right? What do we control? We control not what happens, we control our reaction to what happens. Yes. And so I of course I knew when I was doing it that it was a chance that some people would be frustrated. So I'm trying to, as I'm hearing some of the people who are offended, I'm having to remind myself, well, why did I make the choice that I made? What are the values from which I made that decision? What was I trying to accomplish? I knew it was inevitable that some people would not agree with that. So if I allow myself to be hurt or distracted or pissed off by that, I myself am being challenged as a Stoic. So I have to just think about it intellectually and ponder it without letting it pierce the bubble, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are so many things that I've taken from that book. Even it's a children's book, right? Yeah. But it made me reread a bunch of Stoic matters, Stoic writings, and re-examine. I mean, for all practical purposes, I knew about Stoicism since high school. Really did not get into it until you called me on to The Boy Who Would Be King. And then that became a deep dive. And I got to say, in many ways, especially psychologically and just looking at life as it's getting crazier and crazier by the day around what's happening around us, it's been invaluable. It's been a lifesaver. And I know it's been in many ways to people I've given the Daily Stoic to as a gift. It's been a lifesaver to them too.
What strikes you about Epictetus' story as you got to spend time with her and probably like I know the time I've spent with Marcus and Epictetus for this project and other projects. I always feel like I get something out of it or something every time I come back to them. I get something different. But what do you think? Her or him? What do you think strikes you most about Epictetus?
Well, the way you've structured the book, her epiphanies don't happen until later on. She's still pushing back at her dad, She's absorbing. She's absorbing subliminally. She hasn't really grasped it in a visceral, obvious sense until later on in the book. Until after she basically recovers and comes to terms with her injury and stuff like that. Which, by the way, a wonk, a nerd would say, "Oh, that's not the way Epictetus broke his leg." Mm-hmm. Well, thank God you didn't tell the real story.
Yeah, should we say that real fast?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah. So Epictetus breaks her leg in the book. In real life, Epictetus breaks his leg, or rather, has his leg broken sadistically by his slave master. There's a story that the we don't know why, but the master is bending Epictetus's leg, maybe as a punishment, maybe as some cruel, bit of torture. And Epictetus says, "If you keep doing that, my leg is going to break. And if you keep doing that, my leg is going to break." And it does break. And Epictetus doesn't cry, doesn't whimper, just says, "I told you that was going to happen." And Epictetus walks with a limp for the rest of his life. I found that, I obviously, as a human being, as an adult, I find that the stoicism, the strength of that to be amazing.
Amazing to the point of being almost
unbelievable.
unbelievable. And God, I don't think I would wait for the opportunity to kill the son of a bitch who did that to me.
I found that to be maybe not the right theme for a book that I do hope people read to children.
Right. No, that's true. That's true.
But sorry, you were saying about
well, there are so many things that Epictetus eventually comes to these epiphanies, comes to these realizations that she's learned from her dad, that she's learning from Rufus, and that she's absorbed and made part of herself, as well as whatever she's bringing, whatever observations and conclusions she's bringing to on her own. And for me, again, I'm just in awe of that kind of. I don't like to use I wouldn't want to use the term at peace with. You're not necessarily at peace with. You're just dealing with a hard life. A hard life that so many in the Roman Empire.
It would have been horrendous.
Yes. I mean, the average lifespan was 30 years old. Why? Because you were worked to death, essentially. You know?
Well, and you weren't a 32-year-old slave wasn't worth anything to anyone because they could be freed, right? So if you died at the ideal thing from the sadistic Roman perspective was wear out your slave by 30 years old. They dropped dead at 29 years and 364 days. You got every penny out of them.
You got your money's worth.
Yeah, exactly.
Good investment, good returns. Yep.
Well, and I agree. And I think if Epictetus comes out of the womb Stoic, right? If Epictetus comes out of the womb, I only care about what I control. I don't think about externals. I'm immune to suffering. You know, in some sense, that takes the heroicness out of the equation, right? Like I heard someone say this about Mr. Rogers. Like if you thought he was naturally that way, then you ignore how hard he worked. You make it when you make him into a saint, you're actually doing him a disservice.
Exactly.
Right? And I think if we think about Epictetus as a superhero, it's not the same story. If you think about James Stockdale as a regular person who gets dropped into this prison camp and he's tortured and he has all the temptations and weaknesses and doubts as a normal person, it makes the sheer incomprehensibility and superhumanness of what he accomplished, it allows you to fully appreciate it. And so I think you have to see Epictetus as going on a journey from a person who would have woken up every day for most of their life convinced that what had happened to them was profoundly unfair and unjust and awful because it was, but strove to find something deeper inside that, an empire of his or her own. That's what makes Epictetus great.
I mean, how many times do I get up in the morning and I'm like, oh, you know, especially if it's, you know, when it's 5:30 and I'm getting up to let the hens and the geese out, you know, back in the yard here. And after that initial agitation, it feels great out there. And it becomes my morning daily meditation, almost more of a meditation than sitting down with repeating something to myself. It becomes peace.
And I'd like to get, I mean, when you hear about stories of war heroes and people who are human trafficked, or people who go through the worst things that human beings go through, there is damage there, right? There is scar tissue and PTSD and issues. And I would like to think that Epictetus had all those things, but worked hard and found some kind of peace and happiness. Like, we don't know what his life was. We know he adopted a young child and sort of raised this, I think it was a boy. I like the idea, you know, that there was not redemption, because Epictetus didn't do anything wrong, but the idea that there was a happy ending to the Epictetus story is probably too simplistic. But I'd like to think there was something good at the end of it, if that makes sense.
Well, there's a sense of the life came to a certain level of fulfillment. Epictetus winds up doing what in the story she wants to do. Can you get any better than that?
Well, does it get any better than, despite all the horrible things that happen to you, despite having every reason to give up on life, to give up on humanity, to throw yourself into drink or pleasure or anything to make up for what's happened to you, Epictetus instead focuses on teaching and finds a way to have a positive impact on a world, to leave a cruel world that mistreated him or her, to leave it better than he or she found it. To me, that's what the meaning of life is all about, and that's what I wanted to capture in the story.
And I think we have done that. I think those last few pages kind of tell you what's going to go on in her life, how she will handle herself.
Well, and we could only allude to it, and they don't perfectly overlap, but I do love the idea that in some ways, Epictetus's life and this story is a prequel to Marcus Aurelius's story, because Marcus Aurelius's life is changed by Rusticus, who in real life gives him a copy of the lecture notes of Epictetus. And so the idea that the speeches of a freed slave, hundreds of miles from Rome, could influence and change the life of the most powerful man in the world. I just love that so much. To me, that's the real meaning and beauty of Epictetus's life, that the least powerful person in Rome goes on to influence and change the life of the most powerful person in Rome.
Yep. I can't wait to see the book.
I can't either. I hope it exists very soon.
When I saw that final rough, everything looked really good. I think we also, in a way that we didn't in the Marcus Aurelius book, we got a lot more into detail about settings.
Yes.
Marcus's story kind of like he's into pictures, and there's hints of what's going on around him. Here in order to make this story work, you really had to get a feel of the Roman Empire, of what life was going on around her.
Yes. I feel like your capturing of Roman life is exponentially more detailed and vivid in this book than in the other one. Not that the other one is insufficient. It was just a different vibe. There was a minimalist vibe to The Boy Who Would Be King. And in this one, I feel like it's much more immersive. And I feel like you did an incredible job.
Yeah, I think the kids and the adults will have a fun time just looking at what's going on in each one of those pictures. And I think there are certain points where we do have the repose or lack. We have this circumstances where we're almost repeating Epictetus's face and her dad through several pages in a conversation. But there's subtle changes in the expressions. But it's much different than a lot of the Roman settings that we have in the rest of the book.
I think that's right. And I'm so excited for you to see it and for everyone else to see it. And I loved working with you, Vic, and I hope the muses visit us again, and maybe there's another book at some point. I have no ideas right now. This one was a surprise idea that visited me in the summer of 2021. So who knows what could happen? But in the meantime, I really appreciate all the work and what you helped me realize.
Well, my pleasure. And I'm looking forward to coming out there. And
I can't wait to see you.
We'll do a little panel thing out there at the bookstore.